Those were the days when, you'll remember them, Rob, when the written word, the quality of the written word is what matters. Whether that world that you are writing about is of your own imagination, but the stories are about the lives of those who lived there. I learned who they were. I read up about St. Andrews in that period, and I say what it is that would have caught their attention. But I was not a statistics guy. As I went on, I was not a policy wonk. As I went on, I was not a typical consultant. I would say always what made the difference was my ability to write.
I'm Rob Simpson.
I'm Rem Westland.
I'm John Hills. Rem's story and more tonight on 70 Minutes. "53 of the 179 graduates of our class of 70 are listed as artsmen, but of those 53, only 3 are shown to have studied for and been awarded an honors degree in political science. Rem Westland was one of them. Those of us who may have bumped into Rem over the decades since our graduation would have encountered a classmate apparently continuing along the path of his chosen studies to pursue a career in government and politics. Indeed, Rem succeeded in and is now happily retired from a career of public service. But, as was revealed to me in recent discussions with Rem, not all was as it appears. There is something about Rem that he confirmed about himself after graduation that paved the way for his success, and that so much makes the man that it continues to define him even a decade into his retirement. Rem's story came with a pleasant side note. In preparing this segment, I had a wonderful, previously never imagined experience. I've had the pleasure of meeting and getting to know another of our class of 70 classmates for the very first time. Who, I asked of Rem, would be a suitable person to interview you about your career and your life passion? To which Rem replied, "That would be my best friend, number 8363, Rob Simpson." Rem went on to tell me that when he and Rob were in grade 2 together in Quebec, as he put it, a tricycle ride away from each other, they were the best of friends. That friendship continues to this day. Rem recounted that when in the late summer of 1965, he, Rem, continued with his grade 12 studies in Quebec City, Rob left him behind to enter CMR Saint-Jean as one of the class of 70. Were Dave Cogden still with us, he could relate another part of the story. Rem and Rob told me that other than Rob, Dave was the first of our classmates whom Rem met when Rob brought him home on Christmas Eve 1965, and the 3 of them attended a YMCA dance together. Rob altered his life path while at CMR and did not continue to RMC, but nevertheless, he's kept in constant touch with Rem since. Indeed, Rob was there at RMC in May 1970 to celebrate Rem and the other 178 of us as we marched off the parade square. Here then are Rem and Rob in conversation about Rem the Writer.
I think my career began as a writer. It was a writer throughout, and a writer I am today. But I think now that's what I dare to call myself.
Well, Rem, we have 25 minutes to cover a lot of ground. So let me save some time with an opening overview, at least as I know it. After you left RMC, you spent a few years in the late 70s studying political science in grad school at Carleton University. Your first real job after the military was with the Task Force on Canadian Unity. Following this were rounds in the offices of 2 federal government ministers and then 22 years in the public service. Your working career wound up as a consultant with an outfit called the Corporate Research Group for several more years. Then, in pursuit of something completely different, you abandoned traditional work altogether to run in the 2011 federal election. Fortunately, I suspect, you lost that election, but have managed to retain your newly found disaffection for paid employment over the ensuing 11 or so years. There you have it. 24 and a half minutes to go. So, apart from this chronology, tell us something about yourself that we don't know.
It's fun, actually, Rob. What got me into this when I talked with you and talked with John. John used the words "the arc of a life," and that series of different things that a person does had me ask myself, "What is the arc of my life when it comes to all those different jobs?" There's a constant thread that runs through them all that I now dare to proudly claim, which is an ability to write, to write clearly. What I do now is write on topics of my own choosing. But I think my career began as a writer. It was a writer throughout, and a writer I am today. So that's what's new to me, in a way, by taking part in this process. I would not have called myself a writer a month ago, but I think now that's what I dare to call myself.
Now, your first book was called Running for the People. Great title, by the way, which recounts your run for public office in 2011. Given that you lost the election, along with it the attendant opportunity to self-aggrandize, what was the goal in writing this book?
That really was the first time that I sat down and I did extensive writing for myself on a topic of my own choosing. I can tell you that the political party I ran for was very unhappy that I was engaging in the exercise and was extremely unhappy when the book was published. But I found by running as one who had studied political science, had worked with ministers, had been at senior levels in the public service, I was completely surprised by all that I ran into. It was amazing. It was thrilling, very disconcerting in many ways. And from the start, when I began seeing when I saw what I was coming into, I wanted to keep a detailed record. So a diary it became. And from there, I said, no, I'm going to write about this and try to get it published. And that's the first book that came out.
Okay, so as you were marching off the parade square at graduation, did you in any way anticipate this kind of mismatch issue?
You know, I kind of did. Mismatch is as I headed into a career, or a front end career anyway, in the Canadian Forces. I said, no, that's not really me. I couldn't put my finger on it. I fell back to a credo that came to me from a speech of the cadet wing commander in our very first year, our very first day at RMC, that stuck with me forever, when Paul Guano rang out the words, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing well. And that's what I hung on to throughout my life, even today. In the military, it began with my working with Sonny Marsh for a couple of years on a statistical system for measuring the efficiency of the supply system of the government. But I was not a statistics guy. As I went on, I was not a policy wonk. As I went on, I was not a typical consultant. I would say always what made the difference was my ability to write.
Well, these decades then that you were sort of a below the surface writer, did you find it frustrating?
No, not at all. But it could have been, Rob. When I was still in uniform, I sat down and I did a lot of work. I spent some time in a retreat in Kingston, and I wrote a long novel, about 500-600 words, put it all together, sent it off to publishers. The advice coming back was great effort, congratulations, but best not to continue with this. Cease and desist. I followed that advice, and I think because of that, I was spared the frustration of being a starving artist. That may well have been where I was headed.
Then tell us more about how writing fit into your career, your actual career as it evolved.
Let's start at the Task Force on Canadian Unity. I got to it through a professor of mine at grad school. Within a short while of being there, I was tagged by one of the co-commissioners to write the report on every single one of the commissioners' meetings. So that went on for 2 years. They enjoyed how I wrote it. They would say, this sounds a whole lot better than I felt it was when we went at it. They would say, you captured what we meant, if not what we said. And there are thousands of pages of my writing now filed away in Canada's National Archives.
Just waiting for someone. As I mentioned at the outset, you had 2 stints with 2 federal ministers. Then you moved into the public service. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was. I was brought into the minister's ranks by Jean-Luc Pepin, who had been a minister in the Pierre Trudeau government. He introduced me to Pierre de Benet, and then to there was another minister there, John Monroe, and he said that his words were, "Here's a guy who can write." So they took me on board to summarize for them what was in the cabinet submissions that they had to read and to write speeches. From there, I went into the public service, where I became a main drafter in different directorates for cabinet and treasury board documents. Was deemed to be one of the better briefers that they'd had. And as a consultant, I wrote those same documents, those CAB docs and those treasury board submissions, this time for a far higher fee. But through it all, I would say, I felt I was a pretty successful writer.
I've never heard anyone describe themselves as a briefer before. Okay, so after that, you rose to senior positions, first as a director general and then as an assistant deputy minister at DND, both of which I might add seem to have realigned with your RMC origins. But tell me, why do you see yourself as a writer, not as a manager?
Between you and me and anyone else who may listen in, my skills as a manager, I really believe that is not what made my career a success. In my latter years, I was working closely with Chris Ford and Bob Starchuk, and they may have the kindness to disagree to some extent. But those were the days when, you'll remember them, Rob, when the written word, the quality of the written word is what mattered. And your submissions that went forward quickly, that were deemed to be clear, that's what gave the organization you were a part of its points. So I would say when I was at the senior levels in these organizations, I sat there less as a senior manager than as the chief editor and writer for the group. So it was not my management skill. I would even say to some extent I co-opted the writing of some folk that were junior to me by saying, look, let's write it this way. In the final round, my most lucrative by far, at the corporate research group, I had no management responsibilities at all. And certainly that is where, at least as measured by money, I did the very best.
Okay, so now you've had more than 10 years to be the independent writer who was always waiting to be released. How's that worked out for you?
It's been very satisfying. My personal experiences have been very satisfying in that I now do really pick on subjects of my own choosing. They're there in evidence in the books that have emerged. There have been rewards. There have been recognition that the quality was there. The first of those books, Running for the People, the one that you had mentioned, got a half-page coverage in the Ottawa Citizen. Most recently, just a year ago, it was cited by Donald Savoy in great sections of it in a book that he wrote on politics in Canada. I had a guest blog on the Samara Center for Democracy because of the content of that book. Once Upon a Time, another book, widely shared among folk in St. Andrews. It was displayed in the window of a shop, a hairdresser's shop of all things, on Main Street, and she would have her clients read it as they waited for their turn. And quite recently, the publisher that I work with said, you know, your writing, I like it. I want you to write the next book in the series that my publishing firm is sponsoring, called the White Glove Fiction Series for young adults. So I felt rewarded, but if I again used money as a measure, I would say I've been profoundly unsuccessful as a published author.
Okay, well, we're going to take a deeper look at one of your books in a moment. But first, tell us what life as a writer is like, what it's been like over the last few years, the inside picture.
and inside it is, because it's an intense, private, isolated kind of thing. The writer, I think all others in the class who have given it a shot will agree, whether that world that you are writing about is of your own imagination or whether it's one that you're actively researching, while you write, you live in the middle of it. We moved to St. Andrews in New Brunswick, partly so Marie could be closer to her father. He's at 97, he still does remarkably well. I went there to really get my feet wet or find my feet as a writer, the kind of thing you and I used to talk about when we were much younger. Have that writerly life. So that's what I did for about 5 years, 6, 7 days a week, from 10 till 1, 10 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. That's all I did. I wrote. But it was a successful round. At the end of it, I could count 4 books, 3 published by the Total Recall Press and 1 by myself. So it's intense, but it's exhilarating, especially the fiction where you control what happens next in your characters. You interact with your characters, and you really feel a dynamic existence, even though all you are is hunched over a desk, clicking away on a machine.
So over the years, you've sent me copies of your books looking for feedback. In responding, I've been frank, because to me, that's what real friends do. But as a voracious reader myself, I've got to say that I've seen genuine talent, and talent that's grown with each release. And I should add, with fewer, perhaps uncharitably thought of, self-inflicted wounds. How, over the years, did you go about making yourself a better author?
It begins with what you yourself have just said. It was daring to take a draft of a piece of work and send it to someone like you, who I knew would take it seriously and critique me honestly. So reviews and critiques, taking them all seriously, hoisting them on board and doing a rewrite and a rewrite and a rewrite. I certainly became a regular at Writers' Fests. Learned a whole lot from the professional editors when a book hits that point where it's time for the editors, copy and content editors to come in. That's a feedback loop that goes on each book for 6-7 months, and from the publisher as well. Mostly though, and I read also throughout, by the way, I don't remember which one you recommended, but there are writers who talk about the craft, and I've read a dozen of those books. So at this stage of the game, I see myself as a fairly competent writer. Again, as I say, a successful writer, but once again, as a revenue-generating author, I don't rank myself as high as J.K. Rowling yet.
Okay, so let's turn to that successful writer side as opposed to revenue generator. I've noted that your book, and your latest book is called Once Upon a Time. I don't know if I can get that in the screen here.
That works.
There we go. It was endorsed by the Charlotte County Archives by the Civic Trust of St. Andrews. But to me, when I read it, it felt like having a conversation with a well-versed historian. And I understand it even included some unexpected RMC overlap. Once Upon a Time, just to give a brief overview, is about the house that you and Marie purchased in St. Andrews. One, it turns out, that locals told you had a long and interesting history. This obviously sparked your interest. You set out to record the names and selected life experiences of every owner since the house was built. And this goes back as far as 1790, believe it or not. So the obvious question is, why would anyone be interested in reading these stories?
As I say, that's the question. And it's the question that goes to authors. Any book that looks like it's going to hit the market, the question is who you're writing for, why did you do this, where do you think your market is? My sense of the answer to that is, Rod, that the stories that are in that book are less about the house. The house is obviously featured. Once Upon a Time, by the way, is the name of that house that was given to it by a previous owner. But the stories are about the lives of those who lived there. So I know, like what you said, I learn who they were. I read up about St. Andrews in that period, and I say what it is that would have caught their attention. So I would say, right from your outset of your question, it's a book that would be of interest to an historian, but especially to folk who are interested in the history of St. Andrews. The starting point, 1790, that's when the house was built. The builder, his life goes back to about 1733 in Scotland. In 1753, when he was about 20 years old, he and a whole gaggle of folk were driven out of Scotland by the British, and they found work in America. In 1783, 30 years later, he and some 40,000 others were driven out by the American Revolution. They elected to stay loyal to King George III. The British ships that took them away has been described as the first modern era evacuation of a mass of refugees. So the stories that turn around this house are indeed why I think the book is interesting. Less the house than the people.
The builder of the house was a man named John Crawford.
Say it in Scottish accent. You're good at that.
John Crawford.
You got it.
I mean, you've described the life there as murder and mayhem. What kind of things were these people dealing with way back at the beginning?
It was unbelievable. We're talking 40,000 people, truly frightened for their lives. In Crawford's case, in his own personal experiences, I don't know what they were, but his neighbor who received land to his immediate right in St. Andrews was a fellow who did write an extensive piece on his sufferings in his search for compensation by the British government. He was made to stand with a crowd around him on his toes in the hope that he would fail and then strangle himself to death while all of his assets were burning there for him to see. In the Annals of Castine, which is where the St. Andrews folk came from, they record that he died, that he was killed. Somehow he escaped. He was one of John Crawford's neighbors. To the back of him was a fellow, also a successful merchant, also lost everything he had. One of his staff in his house jumped up to try to put the silver, turn the lock on the safe there, lost her hand, was taken off by a sword. He himself was 3 months in irons aboard of an American ship. So they came truly from murder and mayhem. They were frightened. They were angry. It was one of those early rounds and continuing rounds, unfortunately, of humans being unkind to humans.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say that not much has changed over the years. But I'm interested in what was the American perspective on all this?
You know, that was also fascinating to me. Initially, I didn't really, that isn't where I thought my interest would go. But now you got to think Ukraine, and you got to think what's happening in that kind of a setting. Remember, the numbers of people we're talking about were small. Their conditions were frigid and difficult in the wintertime. What the British, when they took these refugees away on their fleets, on their ships, they took with them on barges all the infrastructure that they could. So they took houses apart, public buildings apart, they kept the hardware, they took the windows, they took all the shingles, and what was still left behind, they burned everything right to the ground. So the Americans in Castine were left with nothing. To the point that when Marie and I went to check out Castine, we went back to a restaurant there. The woman who served us, at one point muttered under her breath, and she said, "You're from St. Andrews?" And she said, you people have our houses." 250 years later, the trauma of that still being felt.
I suspect she also blames it on socialism. Give us another highlight.
Well, socialism opens the door to that, the rich-poor gap. What I learned by following what the people who were residents in this house did, there was a sudden break where they stopped being sailors, they stopped being victualers of ships, they stopped being shipbuilders, and they became gardeners. They became servants in houses. When the motor vehicles came in, they became truck drivers. A real sharp gap. I read up around St. Andrews to find out why that might have happened. And I learned it happened all over town. In 1885, the St. Andrews Land Company, which was an investment firm funded by a number of high-end, high-wealth individuals, purchased land all along the ridge of the St. Andrews Peninsula, built their mansions, and almost overnight, St. Andrews became a feudal town. There was the castle on the hill, the Algonquin Hotel. There were the mansions of the lords and the ladies. The town became a service-providing town. The gap between the rich and the poor became profound, and it hasn't changed in the 150 years since.
I'd like to circle back at this point, though, to my earlier teaser line, the unforeseen crossovers with the class of 70 members. What was the crossover? What was the event that you stumbled upon that was interesting?
When I was asking myself the question, what would a resident in a particular time have drawn, what would their attention drawn to? I would ask it about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the people who were around me who would have been living in the town at that time. When I came to the 80s, when I was knocking on doors, I learned that in 1984, everyone in town was glued to their television sets. They were watching the liftoff of Mark Garneau into space. And why was that? Turns out that Mark's mother was one of 5 Richardson sisters who lived with her mother, Mark's grandmother, just down the street. The locals then began to tell me that they knew Mark well. Now, whether that's true or not, who can say, but they said they knew him, they knew his brothers. I just know that Mark would have swum in Katie's Cove like I did, which was a warmed cove at the edge of the bay there. So that was a kind of a I knew him too moment that helped to integrate me in the community.
I can remember myself from my brief stint at CMR. Mark was an incredible swimmer.
Yeah.
Nobody I can recall was as fluid as he was, if I could use that bad pun.
That is exactly right.
Have you got one more crossover for us?
Yeah, that one was fun too. When I was researching, of course, the Loyalists came north along with the black Loyalists, those who were the freedmen, those who were indentured servants, who went with the Loyalists up also to St. Andrews, but certainly throughout the Maritimes. So I began to research the presence of the black in St. Andrews, to learn that about a dozen families established themselves at the edge of town in a shanty, really, that went by the name of Slabtown. As I did that research, I crossed paths with Ray Riddell to learn that he and his wife were actively researching black history in all of New Brunswick. It meant that Ray and I would cross paths in the library in St. John and have discussions on this subject. So it was another fun crossover.
It's another dimension that's totally surprising.
Yeah, it was.
Not just to me, I suspect to most people. And what was the name of the town? Slabtown?
And the reason it was called Slabtown, Rob, is that the trees would come in, they would be, the barks would be removed, so you would have a log that now could become part of the home that you were building. The slabs were all thrown to the side, and the blacks were entitled to pick the slabs out, so their houses were walled by slabs on timber rather than wood on timber.
Slabtown. Amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
Okay, let me wrap up with a final question. Are you still writing? Do we look forward to something new coming off in the near future?
And the answer is absolutely yes. One of the writers whom I read about the writing craft said, she said that writing is what I do and I'm not living a real life. Here at the cottage, I live a real life. There's a lot to do, so I don't write a lot. But there is another book that's coming out, that is coming out even now as we talk. This morning I put about a dozen copies in the mail to various people in the hope that it might be read and critiqued. And it's in the young adult series. It's the one that I mentioned that the publisher sponsors. And my next project after that, the research is already done. I want to write about Charbot Lake, where this cottage is. I want to talk about how it got to be what it is. I've researched what makes this lake, what water flows into it, and what flows out of it, and how many teaspoons of water that constitutes. I'm thinking I'm going to write that up, and I'm engaging, I hope, one of my daughters in that, who's a professor of geography and writes in the same area of interest.
And that's an amazing coincidence. Someone just asked me the other day how many teaspoons of water I imagined Charbot Lake contained. So I'm going to refer them to you.
There you go.
This has been great. I want to close with a shameless plug for viewers. You can access Rem's book simply by Googling his name and Amazon.com. And the offerings even include this latest book that Rem referred to, a magical jackrabbit who discoursed with a well-known religious figure in what I like to think of as the tradition of Dostoevsky. The more he sells, the faster his status as a financially unrewarded author will fade. With that, John, back to you.
Thank you very much, Rob.